Hi everyone, welcome back to English 221. This is our class for Monday, the 6th of February, where we are transitioning from our introduction, talking a little bit about Shakespearean biography and Shakespearean society, and moving to our first set of readings, the sonnets. And as you know, the sonnets are meant as, in part, preparation for our play reading, which begins with The Midsummer Night's Dream. So I'm hopeful that during this time, while we've been talking about Shakespeare, you've been getting ahead of the readings so that you have read the sonnets and you are in the midst of A Midsummer Night's Dream, so that when we finally get to that play, hopefully you would have finished it in its entirety. When we're talking about A Midsummer, you're reading the next play, Much Ado. However, I'm aware that that may not necessarily be possible, so do the best that you can. But I wanted to talk a little bit today about Renaissance politics and Queen Elizabeth, who was luckily for us a patron of the arts. And if she hadn't been a patron of the arts, I'm not so sure these plays would have survived for us to read them and to watch them. As you know, playwriting and play acting was seen as somewhat of an unsavory profession, but nobody was going to question the queen. And as I had indicated last class, this was very much a society that was based on hierarchy and ranking. In something known as the chain of being, everything had a particular position in society, and it started with God, who would be at the utmost top of the chain. And then the angels would be ranked accordingly, and then human beings would be ranked accordingly, and then finally animals on the planet Earth would be ranked accordingly. So much so that squirrel were considered to be vermin, for instance, so therefore the lower classes would be allowed to hunt squirrel, as opposed to deer, which would be considered to be a more appropriate animal for the higher classes. And the idea behind the chain of being is that one was born into a particular position, and that illustrated a particular ability to reason or not reason. But Shakespeare played fast and loose with this idea by showing us characters who would ascend the chain of being, oftentimes lower level characters who would speak in poetry or verse rather than prose, because poetry was seen to be a higher form of language. Or we would see the opposite, somebody from the higher levels who would be basically speaking in prose. So seeing the contrast in the language would be very useful. It was quite a daring political statement, and Shakespeare made quite a few daring political statements, but they weren't obvious because at the time one could be quite open about sexuality and violence, but not necessarily about politics. And this gets us back to Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen because she never married and she never had heirs. This would be particularly important because that means that it wasn't clear at the ending of her reign, who would take over her position because there wasn't a direct male heir. And that was something that was on everyone's minds, but it wasn't something that would be talked about publicly. Certainly, it's something that's addressed in Shakespeare's history plays. So when we get to Richard II, for instance, we'll talk a little bit about how that play examines who should have the ultimate responsibility for rule. Should it be based on birthright or should it be based on ability? And again, with Queen Elizabeth, there wasn't a clear heir. The result of all of this, which would have been towards the tail end of Shakespeare's career when Queen Elizabeth finally passed away, was that a distant relative, King James from Scotland, basically became the king. And the next Shakespearean play that's thought to have been written after that transition of power is Macbeth, which happens to be about a Scottish king. I don't think that's any coincidence. King James, while he didn't necessarily mind the arts, he was not particularly fond of them either, oftentimes arguing that plays were too long, and Macbeth happens to be Shakespeare's shortest play. Again, it would seem that Shakespeare was writing to appease the powers that be, which makes a lot of sense. And also, King James is very interested in the supernatural. If you know anything at all about Macbeth, it definitely focuses on issues of the supernatural. And in fact, we will see in his sonnets and also his dramas how he would take the opportunity politically to advance his position or to support his patron or to flatter a patron or perhaps the queen in power. Again, Shakespeare was a very savvy business person. The master of revels would have been the censor at the time, and again, the censorship would have mostly been about obvious political statements. But Shakespeare very covertly oftentimes questioned the established order. And the irony is that if one truly followed the established order of the chain of being, then men would be above women, or men would be above women, and ultimately Queen Elizabeth was a woman and a very powerful and successful ruler as well. Perhaps one of the reasons why Shakespeare defied some of the stereotypes of his time by giving us some strong female characters who oftentimes defy societal expectations, sometimes even successfully, as we shall talk about with A Midsummer Night's Dream. But I know that one of the biggest issues with Shakespeare is about language, and that his language can be rather challenging. I've likened it before to a foreign language, one that you have a good understanding of, perhaps 80% or so, but you still have to pick up the rhythms and you still have to pick up some of the definitions of the time. Much like spelling was not standardized at the time, as I responded to many of you in your discussion forum questions. And as you know, you are not required to respond to your peers' discussion forum responses, but you are required to read their responses. And you will see that I've responded to each of you in turn as well. And some of you indicated that you found the idea of Shakespeare spelling his name differently in different documents rather suspicious. But as I had indicated to you, it wouldn't have been that unusual for multiple spellings to exist, even for one's name, because spelling hadn't been standardized. The same for definitions. Definitions hadn't been standardized either. Oftentimes, language was created by playwrights and certainly by Shakespeare, and sometimes never used again, which is why I encourage you to use an edition of Shakespeare that comes with footnotes. Pelican is usually a trusted publisher. As you know, I had indicated on the syllabus that I'm fond of the Riverside Shakespeare because that's what I used when I was an undergraduate, even though I believe it's out of print now. The Folger Shakespeare Library is a great resource for finding all Shakespearean works, but the versions of the plays that are available for free do not have footnotes. And the advantage of footnotes is that you've got editors to try to help you with the language. Of course, an editor is guessing as to what words you would need to have defined. So some editors are better than other editors in response to that. And ultimately, language was used differently during Shakespeare's time than it is in our time. One of the examples that I give is the word die, D-I-E, which means for us in contemporary times, the ending of life, or it could also mean a singular in dice. But during Shakespeare's time, it also meant orgasm. So anytime Shakespeare is talking about dying, D-I-E, there's a bawdy possibility for interpretation. He was quite aware of that. And as I had discussed earlier, Shakespeare appealed to all levels of audience. So he definitely wanted to have lots of levels in his writing. And there are a good number of double entendres and hidden messages that make his language somewhat challenging, in addition to the fact that language had not been standardized during the time period. I have two videos for you to watch. And one talks about Shakespeare's original pronunciation. And that also is somewhat problematic, is that we put modern pronunciation on Shakespearean words. And that can sometimes get in the way of things like rhyme, because oftentimes Shakespeare would utilize poetic techniques in his writing, like rhyme and meter. And the way a word would have been pronounced during Shakespeare's time may not necessarily be the way a word would be pronounced during our time. So scholars have tried to unearth how language would have been pronounced during Shakespeare's time, and they call that the original pronunciation of Shakespeare's plays as opposed to the contemporary pronunciation. The video I have for you to see is about 10 minutes long or so from the Open University, where you have two scholars, father and son no less, talking a little bit about the difference between the original pronunciation and the contemporary pronunciation with some examples. And they do so in the Globe Theater. If you remember, we had talked a little bit about the importance of the Globe Theater for our understanding performance, because ultimately performance would have been adapted for the theater itself. I also wanted you to see another video that's 8 minutes long. I don't want to say much about it because I don't want to give you spoilers, but it's about the difference between our contemporary language and Shakespearean language. And as I've always maintained, that once you know the plot of a play, you can truly appreciate the subtleties of the language. The difficulty is that if this is your first read-through of a play, you are struggling with plot, which is why I always talk about how I wish that Shakespearean plots were taught in elementary school, because if students already had an understanding of the plot, then they could proceed directly to the language. But that said, you'll see in this 8-minute video, and both are on YouTube, you can see the notes below in the second section under Renaissance language, that once you know the plot for a story, then you can really play with the language. So I hope that you find both of these videos informative. And I use both as an indicator that you don't need to necessarily understand Shakespeare word for word. Even the scholars can't do that. So I talked about sometimes in footnotes, there will be a definition of a word followed by a question mark. And this is editors' and scholars' best guess as to what that word might have meant during Shakespeare's time. And occasionally you will also get Shakespearean text, and within the text you will see square brackets. And that's a basically way of notifying the reader that anything within the square brackets was not original to the text itself. This was an addition that was included by the editor. This is their best guess based on content and rhyme and meter and all of the elements that go into consideration with language. So even the scholars can't necessarily understand word for word. We're beginning with the sonnets because they are shorter pieces, obviously, than a drama. And I think they expose us not only to Shakespearean language, but they also expose us to some of the themes that we will see repeated throughout Shakespearean dramas. The sonnets have been used to try to piece together a Shakespearean biography. As you know, we know very little about Shakespeare, and it's a dangerous game to try to use the sonnets to indicate what may or may not have happened in Shakespeare's life, because ultimately they are a creative piece of work. So they don't necessarily need to reflect Shakespeare's biography. And many times the sonnets will contradict themselves. And humanity contradicts itself, so I find that to be quite appropriate. So if you're using the sonnets to try to date something like Shakespeare's age or his sexual orientation, that can be very problematic. So I think of the sonnets not necessarily as an examination of Shakespeare's biography, but just an examination of Shakespeare's writing and his incredible ability to understand the human condition in all of its forms. He wrote 154 sonnets. We think that most of them were written during plague, when the theater houses would have been closed. And these are 14-line poems, and the sonnets have a very strict structure in terms of length, in terms of rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern, which is determined by the last word of each line. And the way we make that determination is by using letters of the alphabet to illustrate a new rhyme. So we begin with the first letter of the alphabet, which happens to be A, and that would be the very first line, the last word of the first line, and that would be a rhyme identified as A. And any other rhymes that follow that rhyme with that first rhyme would be identified as A. And then when we go to our second rhyme, which would be the last word of the next line that has a new rhyme, that would be identified as B. And we would go down the letters of the alphabet, and then we would try to determine whether or not there's a pattern in the sonnets or a pattern in anything that we're reading. And I can tell you that in Shakespearean sonnets or Renaissance sonnets, there are other kinds of sonnets, but usually when we talk about sonnets, we talk about Shakespearean sonnets. The pattern you will see is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then finally two last lines that rhyme together. That would be known as a couplet, and that would be known as GG. So they're very strict parameters that needed to be followed in terms of length, in terms of rhyme, also in terms of meter. It would be a 10-syllable line. So take perhaps Shakespeare's most famous line, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Or shall I compare thee to a summer's day? A sonnet that we will indeed be reading. That's 10 syllables. And you will see throughout Shakespeare's sonnets, they maintain that 10-syllable line. They also are supposed to be addressing lofty themes or issues that would be important enough to dedicate a sonnet to. Life, love, death. Certainly you wouldn't want to talk about anything base or ordinary. The sonnets don't have titles, so we refer to the sonnets either by their first line, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, or by their number. Editors have tried to give a numerical order to these sonnets. Again, we know very little about Shakespeare. As you know, we're not even necessarily sure of the dating of his works. But the sonnets have basically been grouped into two groups, one called the early set of sonnets. Those are the earlier numbered sonnets. And the later set of sonnets, and those are the later numbered sonnets. And it's thought that the early set of sonnets are written primarily to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, someone who was Shakespeare's patron, someone that Shakespeare wanted to flatter for political and financial reasons. And it's thought that the later sonnets are written primarily to a woman known as the Dark Lady because of her dark features. She would have dark hair and dark eyes, not necessarily dark skin. And those sonnets are thought to have been written to someone that perhaps Shakespeare was infatuated with or perhaps even had an active love affair with. It's debatable. So some suggestions that I have for you for reading the sonnets and actually just for reading Shakespeare in general. You want to read out loud. You want to hear the language. And that said, I will be reading some of the sonnets, but this first sonnet that we have assigned, Sonnet 15, I have Sir Patrick Stewart reading. You might be familiar with Sir Patrick Stewart, an actor perhaps who gained his biggest fame through playing Captain Jean Picard in Star Trek, but he is a Shakespearean trained actor who has just a wonderful voice. And the story of him reading the sonnet is quite interesting. It was during the beginnings of the lockdown in 2020 for COVID-19. And if you will remember, we were not able to leave our homes. And what Patrick Stewart did was he decided to read a sonnet a day, thinking that this would be a way that he can contribute through his artistry to entertain individuals who basically were isolated at home. He never envisioned that he would run out of sonnets before we actually were done with COVID, but that's exactly what happened. So you can see him read all of the sonnets, but since we are reading Sonnet 15, I thought it would be very nice to have him read that sonnet, and you'll see this under the fourth section of our notes below. Patrick Stewart reading the sonnet, or Patrick Stewart, I should say, reading the sonnet. It's about a minute and a half or so. One of the things that I really enjoy about his reading is that he admits how uncertain he is. First, about the meaning of the sonnet, and second, about his reading of the sonnet, even though he's Shakespearean trained. I love his humility. One of the things I recommend when you read a Shakespearean sonnet in particular, but Shakespeare in general, is that you paraphrase, that you try to put it in your own language. And then especially because the sonnets are short, that you reread them. And then you identify themes. And you try to examine language. Things like imagery, symbolism, metaphor, rhyme, alliteration, and so forth. So with Sonnet 15, which Patrick Stewart can read so much better than I can, but I will attempt to read Sonnet 15 to you. And this sonnet reads, when I consider everything that grows, holds imperfection, but a little moment, that this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, whereon the stars in secret influence comment. When I perceive that men as plants increase, cheered and checked even by the selfsame sky, vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, and wear their brave state out of memory. Then the conceit of this inconstant stay sets you, most rich in youth, before my sight, where wasteful time debateth with decay, to change your day of youth to sullied night, and all in war with time for love of you. As he takes from you, I engraft you new. Now again, you probably are going to have to read this sonnet multiple times, and I wanted to draw your attention to some of the elements. The use of I, when I consider, so this is definitely the author speaking, everything that grows holds imperfection but a little moment. Shakespeare will oftentimes use vegetation imagery and the idea of growth in order to illustrate what happens with humans. And that a moment of perfection is fleeting. One of the things that we will oftentimes see in Shakespeare is this lament about the descent, decay, and ultimate death of all living things. But writing does not necessarily have to experience descent, decay, or death. Because as long as the writing exists and there is someone to read the writing basically becomes eternal. It's a theme that we will see in perhaps his most famous sonnet when he talks about, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, sonnet 18. But also, what I wanted you to think about was his reference to the stage. He will oftentimes, with a wink and a nod, make reference to the fact that he's a playwright or a dramatist, or that we're watching a play, or that life is like fiction and fiction is like life. And this actually has a term. It's called metadrama, when you're making a direct reference, which he says, this huge stage presenteth naught but shows, saying that life is basically like a stage and we're merely actors or players, if you know that particular line. When I perceive that men as plants increase, so there is the connection with humanity, basically, much like vegetation, and that there is a growth and ultimately a descent. That men as plants increase, cheered and checked by the self-same sky. Oftentimes there's references to the idea of the sky as representational of perhaps spirituality or God. Vaunt in their youthful sap, at height decrease, that we all reach a pinnacle or a point of perfection, and then there's a decrease, this rise and fall, almost like you see the rise and fall of an action that would occur in a drama, so much so that we divide Shakespeare's dramas into 5 acts in a pyramid structure. That Act 1 is on the left side of the pyramid, and it is basically the introduction of character. And then Act 2 is the beginning of the ascent of the pyramid, and that is the beginning of conflict. And Act 3 is the pinnacle or the point of the pyramid, and that is the height of the conflict. And Act 4 is the beginning of the descent of the pyramid on the right-hand side, or the beginning of the resolution of conflict. And then finally, Act 5 of the pyramid, which is at the bottom of the right-hand side of the pyramid, which is resolution. So that rising and falling pyramid structure is something that we not only see in Shakespeare's writing, but from Shakespeare's perspective, this is also the pattern that we see with life, that we begin in childhood and we rise up to adulthood, the pinnacle, and then there's the beginning of old age, and then finally death, which is descent. And talking about the idea of humanity paralleling the natural world with its aging, also talks about the idea of inconstancy. Things are constantly changing, whether it be in the natural world or whether it be in humanity. And it's not just our life cycle, but it also is our temperament, our character, our personality. Notice that the words time and decay in this sonnet are capitalized, which gives them a sense of personification, giving human traits to inanimate objects. That basically time and decay are the enemies to our state of perfection. This is what leads to our descent. To change your day of youth to sullied night. Basically, time and decay are the enemies that we all fight against. And then the last two lines, that couplet, which serves as a kind of summary statement, almost like a concluding paragraph in a paper, if you will. The power of the poet to immortalize. And all in war with time, notice the capitalization of time, in love of you, as he takes from you, meaning time, I engraft you new. And think about engrafting as a vegetative term that we renew by implanting. And basically Shakespeare's saying he's able to do such a thing through verse, giving a kind of godlike power to the poet, because only God should be able to immortalize, but Shakespeare suggests that the poet can as well, which is especially evident in our next sonnet, Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, which is probably the most commonly misread poem in literature, which is what I'll talk about next class. I had to leave you with a cliffhanger. So next class, we'll finish the sonnets. We'll discuss the journals, because you will be having your first journal due on the 13th, which is Monday, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, because that's what works best with my grading program, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And we'll also start talking about the first drama that we're going to be spending a couple of weeks with, because we will be watching performance as well as talking about the drama itself. As I indicated, we will be watching a performance that was done in the Globe Theater itself. Obviously, as you watch it, you will see that it was modernized on some levels, but I think that despite the small tweaks, it really is a very faithful production to A Midsummer Night's Dream. We'll see whether or not you agree or disagree with me. So, for our attendance question, and this will be due on our class discussion forum by Wednesday, the 8th at 8 a.m. And of course, if you need additional time, please let me know. And as you know, you don't have to respond to your peers, but you do have to read your peers' responses, and I will, of course, be responding to all of you. So I read everything you send me. So after watching the video about original pronunciation and modern pronunciation, which do you prefer? Original pronunciation or modern pronunciation, and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting some closure onto Shakespeare's sonnets. Take care. Bye-bye.